video, I'm going to show you guys how to build an incredibly powerful $1,500 gaming PC build that really can do it all when it comes to gaming at 1080p, 1440p, and even a bit of 4K. It's a system made up of some really great components that are going to perform well, be relatively easy to assemble, and provide solid upgrade paths too. So let's dive into it after a quick word from today's video sponsor. The Cooler Master GM34CWQ2 is a 34-inch ultra-wide gaming monitor set on a 1500R curve with a sharp 3440 by 1440 resolution. The quantum dot panel is rich and vibrant, while the stock 165Hz refresh rate can be overclocked up to 180Hz for extra performance. AMD FreeSync Premium support, a 0.5 millisecond response time, and 4000:1 contrast ratio make this monitor both practical and a panel that looks the part. Learn more at the first links in the description below. Typically, in a $1,500 gaming PC build, you'd be looking for something like an RTX 4070 or RX 7800 XT. But today, I really wanted to push the boundaries and see how far we could go. And that's where this comes in. This is AMD's RX 7900 XT. That's right, this is AMD's one but highest end GPU in their current Radeon 7000 stack, and a card that outperforms the 7900 GRE, the 4070 Super, and even knocks on the door of the 4070 Ti Super 2 for good measure. Squeezing this thing into a $1,500 budget wasn't easy, and I'm going to show you how I did it. But as you can see, this build clocks in on Newegg at about $1,460, $1,470 with the promo codes and discounts. Pretty impressive. The 7900 XT is a really remarkable GPU. AMD made the same mistake they've made on this card with basically their whole lineup. It was too expensive when it launched. Everybody said, well, it's okay, but it's too expensive, and nobody bought it. Since then, they've dropped the price right down. These things can now be found in the region of like $600. It's pretty crazy. And for that, they provide pretty extraordinary value for money, coming in cheaper than the 4070 Ti and newer 4070 Ti Super, and actually closing the gap a little bit to the 7900 GRE. The big winner with this though comes in the form of VRAM. You get 20GB, which is 4GB more than the GRE. You get 8GB more than the 4070 and 70 Super, and that's going to be great for higher res gaming at 1440p and 4K. Now, in terms of getting this in, one of the sacrifices I did make was with the CPU. And I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way, but AMD's Ryzen 5 7600X is the choice I went for. Now, typically in this build, I would try and go for a low-end Ryzen 7 chip instead, or even squeeze in AMD's 7800X 3D. But at 1440p and 4K, where the CPU is less of a bottleneck, this makes a lot of sense. To be clear as well, overall, you're still going to see better gaming performance with a 7600X and a 7900 XT than you would on, say, a 7800X 3D and a 7900 GRE. The point being, you're better spending the extra cash on a more powerful GPU than a more powerful CPU. Going for Ryzen though unlocks a few major benefits. The first being that this AM5 socket used by this CPU and others will be supported for upcoming Ryzen 9000 chips and beyond, and we get the advantages of B650 motherboards, which are cheaper than their Intel counterparts and give us a whole host of great benefits. That's probably a good time then to talk about which B650 board I've selected for this build, and that is where the B650 Eagle AX comes in. Now this, I want to hasten to say, might be the best value overall B650 board right now. Now it isn't the cheapest compared to some options from the likes of ASRock on their ProRS range, but it's crucially cheaper than most mid-range MSI Asus boards, coming in at around the $140 mark. Latest pricing and availability will be linked below for the UK, US and other regions too. Now I like this board for a number of key reasons. The ATX form factor is nice, it fills out standard cases rather than looking dead tiny. The I/O and connectivity is just really strong. From the high-speed USB ports to integrated Wi-Fi, the Ethernet port is only 1 gigabit rather than say 2.5 gig you might find on higher end designs, but frankly, who cares? And in areas where it really matters, like the M.2 slot, CPU power delivery, and 4 RAM DIMMs, a lot of boxes are being ticked by this GIGABYTE design. Into the design, I'll also be installing 32 gigabytes of CORSAIR's Vengeance Expo memory. This is their AMD specific kit with the Expo profiles, meaning in theory, it should just work. GIGABYTE and CORSAIR boards and memory always seem to team well together. One massive advantage of this kit that makes it perhaps justifiably slightly more expensive is that it's on the QVR list for basically every single B650 motherboard in existence. Installing a Ryzen chip is just so simple. Triangle on the top left corner, keep a note of where that is, lift up the arm, lift up the socket, or the cover which has come off apparently. Normally you can keep that on and it will automatically release itself before then dropping the processor in. Line up the golden triangle on the CPU with the same triangle level we noted a little bit earlier, pop the socket down, and we are good to go. Memory is next. I'm going to use the 2nd and 4th slots for this build. They're the standard slot configurations for basically any modern gaming PC build. And once we're booted up, this Corsair RAM is going to look nice with that little RGB heat spreader too. Yes, you could go for a standard boring non-RGB kit, but what fun would that be? It fits in the budget, so I have no complaints or problems. As far as the SSD is concerned, this is where Crucial's P3 Plus comes in. This P3 Plus drive is a 1TB option that you can save money with a 500 gig or spend more for a larger 2TB drive. I talked recently in a video about how you really need a Gen 4 NVMe drive in a build nowadays, otherwise you introduce storage bottlenecks, and for the price, it just doesn't make sense to try and scrimp and save here when a drive like this is going to set you back $50, $60, really is remarkable. This might seem slightly controversial, as it's usually best practice to install this under the slot with the heat spreader. However, in our testing, this doesn't run that hot, and if we leave the one with the heat spreader free, it means that future Gen 5 NVMe drives are going to slot in much more easily, and you won't have to remove this. Now, it looks like they've got some sort of toolless, I want to say toolless mechanism. Aha, there we go. So just pull that out, make sure that's tight, I suppose. Then slide the drive in, 45-degree angle, little bit like so. Come on, there we go. Push it down, then just add the little pin into place. That is nice and easy. It's a more basic, cheaper toolless method, but obviously this is a more basic, cheaper motherboard, so I have no problems whatsoever. Talking of, I don't want to say basic and cheap, that feels slightly mean. This is the CPU cooler I've gone for, and it's undoubtedly on the budget end of the liquid cooler spectrum. And it's Corsair's, no it's not, it's Cooler Master's Masterliquid 240L Core ARGB. Now, Cooler Master are really fantastic at CPU coolers. They always have been. And in fact, many of the CPU cooler designs you'll see on the market actually come from Cooler Master. Those AMD stock cooler fans you've used before, it's a Cooler Master design. Now again, you might be slightly confused for thinking why I've gone for a liquid cooler in a build with a Ryzen 5 7600X. The reason being, this is currently really cheap. I think this was about $60 or so on Newegg, maybe even slightly less than that. And again, it all comes down to those upgrade paths. It means that if you then drop in a higher end CPU later, you aren't necessarily going to have to upgrade the cooler. Plus, stock coolers are noisy, air cooler's still going to set you back $30, $35, maybe $40 for a decent one. You might as well spend the extra 20. This build has the budget for that, and this isn't what's affected our CPU choice really. Plus, the extra 2 fans in this cooler provide a bit more airflow and help to fill out the case as well. Radiator support on the front and the top in this Fractal chassis, which I'll move on to in a moment. As you can see, 2 RGB fans. They are more basic, they are more simple. They're not going to set the world on fire, but frankly, we don't need it for a build like this. What's quite clever about this cooler is that it actually uses the stock AMD mounting hardware to fasten to when it comes to the CPU. So the actual process is very, very simple. All you need are the 2 brackets in this bag here with these little retention clips on. So I'm going to screw those to the bottom of the water block, install the fans onto the underside of the radiator. I'll be using this at the top in exhaust, and the rest can wait until a bit later. Cooler prep all sorted, motherboard assembly ready to go, and GPU talked about. The next step is the case, and this is Fractal Design's Pop Air RGB. Now, they have a range of different versions of this case available. There's like a mini one, you can get different color motherboard trays. It's really quite funky, and in my experiences building in it, which is a couple of builds so far, I really like it. Best port of call with any case is to take off all of the panels, front and rear, before checking the location of the existing motherboard standoffs. Let me show you what's going on. Starting at the top, and you can see all the standoffs are in the right location. Similarly, down the middle, the 3 are all looking A-OK. However, we're missing 2 down here at the bottom, and there's 2 extra ones that have obviously been moved to facilitate for micro ATX motherboards. You want to make sure these are all in the right locations so that the motherboard doesn't ground out against the case. If that happens, that is not a good thing and could cause some serious damage to your other components. So get these located so that there's 3 at the top, 3 along the middle, and 3 right down the bottom with no extras or spares in sight. And only once you've done that is it then safe to actually install the motherboard. This one has a built-in I/O shield, which you can't take for granted on budget motherboards, even nowadays, making its installation really simple. Hold it by one of the heat sinks, line it up, and slide it in. Now, on some chassis, I'm hoping, yes, this one's included. Either the standoff is raised or it's a post in the middle to hold the board in, at least while you screw it down. You want to screw all the screws in, really, just to keep it secure and ensure the board isn't going to go anywhere. 3 screws at the top, just the 2 along the middle, and 3 down the bottom to secure it in. And then I was about to say CPU cooler, but that would be a mistake. Power supply is actually the best bet next up. The reason for this is because there's not a whole load of room at the top. So while the radiators should fit with no problems, at least that's what I'm hoping. If not, we can move it to the front. Let's just do a cursory check. Yeah, easy peasy. Obviously, the cables will be on the other side when I actually install it, but you're not going to be able to access things like the fan headers, but more importantly, the CPU power cable. So power supply, I think, is our next port of call. Talking of which, handily, here it is, Thermaltake Smart BM3 750. Now this, I've used this so many times. If you've watched the channel regularly, you'll think, James, not again. Why? Why? There's nothing else. There's literally nothing else for the price. And the reason is because there's just nothing else on the market like it, at least not that's ATX3, and that is this affordable. The only other options that spring to mind are the likes of Deepcool's 7 and 850 watt units, but obviously there's some problems getting hold of those in the US right now, meaning Thermaltake, your Smart BM3, wins out again. It's semi-modular, so you save a bit of money there. However, it's as good as a fully modular unit in my mind. Why? Because the only cables that come plugged in are CPU and motherboard, and everybody needs those. It's ATX3, so you get the new Gen 5 power cable, and overall, the power delivery is just better. The ATX3 standard, outlined by Intel, isn't just about new connections. I keep saying this, it's about the way power is delivered too. Cables come in this nice little Thermaltake bag. And inside, we're going to need a few things. We don't actually need the ATX3 GPU. The standard one is going to be fine. And I'm also going to grab a SATA power cable too. Looking at the CPU, it is a pair, yes, 2 8-pins, so that's fine as well. Cable-wise, that is all that we need. As far as installation goes, fan down to pull in fresh air from under the case, slide it into the rear, get it all lined up, and then of course, 4 screws, 1 in each corner to secure it in. I'm going to do cables and wiring now while I have the chance. Motherboard goes to the right-hand side, nice and simple. CPU up to the top left-hand side of the motherboard. Again, very easy, while the front panel cables we can also get out the way at this stage. JFP1 goes down to the bottom right. These are the pins. They're a bit complicated, so the diagram on screen should help. While I'll also be plugging in USB 3 of the Type A variety. No Type C on this case. That's one of the only downsides really, as well as HD audio, which goes to the bottom left and has a pin blocked out, meaning it will only install one way around. Then I can install the all-in-one, so I'm going to thread those cables through. Cable management in this case is quite good, even though there's not really any grommets. The metal is folded over, it's not very sharp. It's a budget case done well, and I think for a build like this, it isn't going to look too cheap, which is good. So, water block, get that in there. A couple of turns of the screwdriver. Just screw this in with 2 screws to begin with, 1 on each end, and I can add the rest in a second. That's going to give my arm a break. Definitely if you're building this with a friend. Sadly, I haven't got any friends to build this with. That would make things a little bit easier. Definitely a bit tight, but it fits, and I see no major problems. Electric screwdriver is always a great way, by the way, of speeding up this part of the process. But much like the motherboard, you want to make sure you install pretty much all the screws when it comes to an AIO. This thing is not the lightest thing in the world, so best to install it properly. And then all that remains is a dab of thermal paste onto our Ryzen 5 CPU before fastening the water block on. Now this is always a little bit more fiddly compared to, more generic installs. However, a bit of perseverance and you should be a-okay. I think what actually doesn't help is the fact that these are thumb screws. If they had a screwdriver thread on, it would actually be a lot easier. So although Cooler Master have tried to make it simple, by having done this, I think they've ironically made it more complicated. And then all that remains is the graphics card. The advantage in the power supply earlier is that the GPU goes in and we're done. In terms of the GPU installation, a couple of PCI lanes to take out. So by the looks of things, it's the second and third. Again, a bit like Cooler Master with the cooler. These are thumb screws, but they're just too tight to do by hand. So as much as I appreciate the thought and the effort, I don't really think it's that necessary. Let me know if you've ever used a thumb screw on your GPU. I guess it's good if you, lose your screwdriver or something, but otherwise I don't really understand it. Anyway, I digress. Pull those lanes out of there. This 7900 XT is like AMD's equivalent of the Founders design. It's not actually a Founders card. Just pick up any 7900 XT you can find at a reasonable price, and that's going to be a-okay. Click it into place. Really works in this build, and secure the 2 thumb screws with a screwdriver head back into place. Get that nice and secure, and then just a pair of 8-pin PCI power cables, and we should be ready to go. The ultimate test, though, is going to be whether this thing turns on. Haven't done a good job building it, and are we going to have any luck? I guess there's only one way to find out. Power supply's on. Power switch? That's not a good start. Let's try that again. I feel things spinning. Fans are spinning at the top. Graphics card and motherboard has a light. Memory's lit up. We've got no light on the RGB, even though it is plugged in for the cooler, so maybe that's a motherboard thing. And no power to those fans at the front either. We've got RGB on the cooler, on the water block, and both the fans. Nothing at the front. So let me see if I can figure that out. I've found the culprit. It was one fan header. I was right, and the whole thing is looking great and ready to go. Arguably, you might want a fan at the rear, but we've got enough exhaust with the radiator at the top with its 2 fans and the 2 intake at the front. So I think all that's left is to look at performance. But first, you guys know what's next. Moving through into performance, and it's no surprise to see this build powered by a 7900 XT performs really well. Such a high-end card for what is actually quite a modest gaming PC build. Call of Duty Warzone was the first example of this. At 4K high with FSR on the quality preset, that's going to give a small boost to frame rate without hopefully too much input lag and visual image quality degradation, and the build achieved a really solid 164 FPS on average. In Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 3, it was unsurprisingly a very similar story when using the same settings. The same game engine in the background here doing all the hard work, so 175 FPS is hardly to be surprised by, but still a great result. Next up was Starfield. This dials the notch up to 11. Starfield, a really hard game to run, 4K high settings, and the build still did well, 70 FPS, breaking through that crucial 60 FPS barrier and delivering a really smooth, arguably fairly competitive gaming experience in a title that is not only hard to run, but where frame rate isn't quite as important as obviously those competitive Battle Royale and esports games alike. Hogwarts Legacy next at 4K high, FSR quality again for this test, and the build delivered 77 FPS on average. Hogwarts really loves VRAM, so the extra video memory of the 7900 XT will certainly be helping, and for me, this result was pretty pleasing. Fortnite at 1080p was a similar story. 1080p competitive settings, that's where everything's tuned down to low, except the render distance, which is set to far, and the build achieved just shy of 300 FPS to be precise. Apex Legends at 4K rounds off all of our testing for this build. High settings here at 4K, and the build again did really well, 162 FPS on average. Of course, if you dial these settings down to medium or even to 1440p, you're going to see a big upside in performance. But I wanted to show you just how powerful this build is and what legs it really has when it comes to fairly entry-level 4K gaming. You can find links to all the parts mentioned today in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to get subscribed. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.